Hey there, I'm Thomas Cashman. I'm the lead programmer on Alchemic Cutie, and today we're going to be talking about how we use Tiled to develop the game. So if you're not familiar with Tiled, it's an open source level editor. It's been around for, I'd say, 10 to 12 years. It's got hundreds and hundreds of features, and it's a very powerful tool. And it's fully open source, so you can add your own features if you want to. You can submit bug fixes, and the file format is completely open. So it's very good for if you're developing your own game engines, or if you want to hook this tool into other engines like Unity or similar tools and engines. So today we're just going to step through how Alchemic Cutie loads the whole world and how you would build a world as a modder. So everything that you see here can be used in mods, and you can add your own maps and islands and so on to the game yourself. So we're sort of beta testing the modding ourselves by building out the game using all the modding tools. So the modding, we hope to launch a modding beta shortly after launch. You'll be able to access everything that we have used to build the game. You'll be able to modify any existing content in the game and also add any new content. The documentation will be available online, and we'll have various tutorials available for adding new content. So let's start with explaining kind of how Tiled works. So normally when you have Tiled, you would have a single map like this, and you would paint in your different tile layers. So you can see here we have like the docks, the water, and what happens is that so when we originally started the project, Tiled only supported single maps. Back in 2018, we sponsored some development on Tiled to add support for worlds. So we can load these world files now, and in the world file we can tell it how to figure out the different coordinates of each map. So in our actual subversion, you can see we have several hundred maps showing off different coordinates and different locations. Each map has a coordinate in its file name, and that coordinate in the file names tells Tiled where to place that map in the world. So the world exists as a 200 by 200 grid, going from negative 100, 100 to positive 100, 100. From negative 50 up to negative 100, negative 100, any map that's placed in that area is considered an indoor map. So what that means is that when that map is shown in game, none of its surrounding maps are rendered. So you can see here we have like the various indoor locations, such as the shops, the police station, and they're all in the minus 50 range. So what happens now is that we have our 200 by 200 grid. So that allows us to specify each surrounding map. So when we have a single map here, we paint it as if it, as it shows visually. Then we have what's called the collisions layer. So the collisions layer marks out where all the collisions are in the world. So you just paint that on visually. During the mod packing, all these little small tile collisions are combined into larger collisions, so that we don't have thousands and thousands of small collisions in the engine. So we have a smart tool that kind of packs up and combines smaller areas into larger areas where possible. This collision layer also acts as an indicator to the engine where the player and characters and jellies and so on should render. So any layers below that will be rendered below the player, and any layers above that will be rendered above the player. The only exceptions to that rule are object layers, which I'll get into shortly. So you can see it's pretty straightforward. It allows Sebastian and Taylor to paint out the world visually and actually kind of get a preview of how the world looks without having to jump into the engine. So, as I mentioned, there are object layers. So the object layers serve various different purposes. They define where spawn points are, where sound emitters are, where warp points are, where jellies spawn, where interactable dialogue objects are. So it's very it's a very visual way of being able to place objects in the game. So for example, you can see here we have a few birds placed up here beside the store and the police station. So what that'll do is spawn some birds in the area. When we have the mod guide available, there will be information on how to configure the object correctly. So usually we configure this type on the tile object properties to specify the actual object type, and then sometimes we have some custom properties as well to specify like the color of the birds, or if it's a jelly spawn area, like what types of jellies to spawn. If it's a dialogue object, what script to run, and so on. So it's a very powerful way of us quickly building out content in the game. So you can see here we have some objects. On the left here is an example of a volumetric sound emitter. So what this is basically doing is putting a spot ambience on a rail, so that as the player moves along this rail, they hear the river as if it's relative to where the player is. We also have pathfinding, so if we want to mark out kind of areas that are considered the fastest route to certain locations, we can mark out these pathfinding objects. Now, luckily in the game, the pathfinding can go to any non-collidable coordinate in the world. The purpose of these pathfinding objects is to kind of hint to the pathfinding that the NPCs or the player should try to use these areas more so than like wandering into the random grass. So it's to make NPCs look like they're actually walking along paths and so on, to kind of nudge them in certain directions. But as I said, in the engine and in mods, you can have NPCs walk to any coordinate in the world. The other type of object we have are waypoints, which are useful for cutscenes. So if you have a cutscene and in your script you don't want to have to specify tile coordinates just in case the map changes later on, you can put waypoint objects and use those references. So that way then later on, if you change around your map, you can move these waypoint objects into the new location without having to go update your scripts. What we also have are the warps. So the warp objects just simply specify any kind of warping, so going from outdoors to indoors. There's different restrictions you can put on those objects. You can say, okay, this warp is only available between certain hours. You can also say it's restricted to being activated by certain quests. So again, very flexible for modders to use. We also have the resource nodes, which is any sort of object that can be picked and fed to a jelly. We use the tile sets. So we have we use the actual tile objects for that. Let me find an example. So we just reference a tile set and paste that in as a tile object, and that allows us to place resource nodes. So you can see it's a very visual process for building out the world. We have a lot of tools available as well for scripting, and our mod packing tool will validate that everything is correct. So we hope that modders should be able to easily build out kind of content themselves and know that it all works in game without issue. We have a lot of tools for scheduling scripts to execute and so on, so you can do timed events. And yeah, so the whole modding system, we're using it ourselves, and we hope that people will have a lot of fun and come up with some cool creative things. So you can see, like, even though we have a 200 by 200 grid, there is a lot of space still available for modders to add new content. And also maybe there will be some DLC coming up where some new content might appear. But I won't spoil anything, and I'm gonna stay around the village just to make sure that I'm not spoiling any of the end game content. Because there's some nice surprises and some really scenic areas at the end game. So let's just go up here now to one of the spawn areas. So this is the swamp area of the island. So we have, or sorry, not the swamp, the marsh. So you can see here we have an example of some spawn areas. So this one here is for spawn items. So we have these pointing to an XML file, we have these pointing to an XML file. So this says to spawn the smelly beans, which are the kind of poop items that the jellies poop. Even though it's poop, we have to still give it a cute name, so they're called smelly beans. And then also we have the actual jelly spawn area on top of that, which is spawning certain types of jellies for this area. So from a design process, we wanted to indicate where jellies were based on, without giving too much away. So as a hint to if a jelly might spawn in a certain area, the smelly beans will appear later on in the day after the jelly's been there. So jellies can appear in morning, afternoon, evening, night. And so let's say in this case here, the jelly is spawning in the morning. So that means in the afternoon, there will be smelly beans in this area because the jelly's pooped. So if you see smelly beans lying around, there's a hint that jellies are spawning there earlier on in the day. So that's pretty much it. We're going to have more information available on the modding at a later date. We hope to kind of do it shortly after launch, a kind of modding beta where we'll make all the tools and the documentation available, and we'll run that beta for a while, and then later on officially release all the mods for the community to download. And so I'm really excited to see what cool content people come up with. Like, we put a lot of work into this world, but I'm sure there are even crazier ideas than what we've come up with that we'll see coming out in mods. In terms of tiles, if you're really interested in the tool, you can download it from mapeditor.org. So yeah, so this has been a very brief introduction into how we're using tiled in Alchemic Cutie. More information will be available when the modding tools are released. As I said, tiled is an open source project. Torbjorn, the main developer, runs a Patreon to sponsor some of the development of it. As I said, we sponsored some development before. So if you're into funding open source projects, definitely check it out. We'll include a link in the description below. And as always, make sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Our Discord is discord.gg/alchemycutie. And yeah, make sure to wishlist us on Steam. All links in the description below. Thanks for tuning in.